I am delighted to introduce my next guest, Dr. John Mortensen. Dr. John Mortensen is a leader in the international revival of classical improvisation, appearing frequently as concert artist and masterclass teacher at colleges and universities in America and Europe. He is noted for his ability to improvise entire concerts in historical styles, including complex compositions such as Baroque fugues. His book on classical improvisation, The Pianist's Guide to Classical Improvisation, with Oxford University Press, will be a comprehensive method for training advanced pianists to improvise in historical styles. He is a Steinway artist and an Ohio artist on tour. In 2017, he was selected as a Fulbright Specialist by the U.S. Department of State to serve as an international artistic ambassador. In 2018, he toured Europe for 3 months, performing and teaching improvised music at conservatories across the continent. His articles appear in International Piano Clavier, College Music Symposium, Piano Pedagogy Forum, and American Music Teacher. Dr. Mortensen studied with Lynn Bartholomew at the University of Michigan, Ann Koscielny, and Raymond Hansen at the University of Maryland, receiving his doctorate in piano performance from the latter. He holds national certification in piano through the Music Teachers National Association and was recently recognized as an Excellence in Education honoree by the Ohio Senate. He now serves as professor of piano at Cedarville University. In 2016, he was named Faculty Scholar of the Year, that institution's highest award. Dr. Mortensen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nico. It's wonderful to talk to you today.
I'm very glad to have you on the show. I've enjoyed your tour of Europe and your work in the field of classical improvisation. Could you describe for me your piano background before we really get into all of the classical improvisation?
I would describe my piano background as starting by being raised by wolves. I had a very incomplete, uneven, scattered music education as a child, partly due to my own lack of focus and attention and desire to play outside and set things on fire rather than practice. Also, family illness. My mother died during that time, and so things like lessons fell away. So that's chapter one, and then chapter two is just trying to catch up to everybody else at the conservatory, because I did fall in love with music and decide I wanted to do it, but without all these years of scales and arpeggios and contests and lessons and everything else. So I really felt like I had to fake my way through a lot, and so those two things, I guess, have kind of defined my approach and my work. Is being a kind of late bloomer and an outsider and always behind and having to figure out how to catch up.
Were you, was it a strict classical background, or did you have some other influences like a jazz or a pop or piano or church kind of background?
By the time I got into, real serious study at the University of Michigan, it was the standard strict background: Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. Pay attention to the eighth note rests. That note says staccato. This note says pianissimo, which I actually needed really badly. I needed to just learn to be honest and to put 4 beats in a bar and learn to hear what I was doing rather than sort of, a lot of kids who just love music, their imagination is so vivid that when they play, they're almost imagining how they sound and they're responding to that, because that imagination, that version in their head is so vivid, and it's actually way better than how they sound in the real world. So it's preferable,
There's a point where you said you fell in love with music. Can you really pinpoint when that happened for you?
Yeah, well, even though my background was very uneven, I was always around music. I'm the son of a Baptist preacher, and so we had choirs and organ music and bell choir and all that good stuff. And I loved rock and roll. As a kid, I played electric guitar, and I grew up.
No kidding.
Oh, yeah. Zeppelin. Later on, 70s prog rock, especially Kansas, Rush and stuff like that. And maybe the harder stuff, Sabbath and AC/DC, all of that stuff is kind of in my blood a little bit. But really, I remember I had quit lessons at 12, and at 15, I went to our high school talent show. And this kid that I knew, he was a friend of mine, he played, I believe, probably it was the Cacciatorian toccata. And, I don't know how well he played it. I'm sure it was fine. But something about that absolutely captivated me. I thought, I love this this whole thing about this. I want this. And I actually, if you can imagine, I went to my dad and I said, can I please go back to piano lesson? And that was kind of the start of me owning it and wanting it for myself.
What was it about that performance? Can you really pinpoint a feeling that you got? Was it the fact that the music was dense and complicated and interesting, or was it just the fact that there was virtuosity in the playing?
I don't know. I mean, I'm sure at the time I didn't have the ability to parse all of that. All I knew was this was amazing and I wanted it.
So you got back to your teacher and then you went to conservatory. Was it pretty much from then on pretty standard fare?
The teacher I went back to had no idea what she was doing. She was just in the neighborhood. But, we didn't know that. She was well regarded in the community. But, this is the kind of teacher I now spend my career undoing their wrong teaching when I inherit their students. Nevertheless, at least I was playing every day and, had some kind of accountability and a little bit of guidance, even if most of it wasn't really all that informed. I auditioned for the University of Michigan and did not pass that audition. I failed that audition. And for good reason, I just wasn't very well trained. It's a very high-level music school. So at that point, I wanted to go there so badly, I started to get sneaky. So I got on the phone with the chair of music theory, and I will say that I was not a born brilliant musician. That's, music is something I've had to work at, but I was born really able to talk my way out of problems. And so I talked my way in over the phone with this guy, got admitted as a theory major, and then got there and started just practicing my head off. And after about a year and a half, they let me change my major to performance. So I sneaked my way in.
Wow. And so you studied with Dr. Lynn Bartholomew and Anne Koscielny, is that right?
Anne was at University of Maryland at grad school. And Lynn was just a fantastic taskmaster for fundamentals that I needed at that time. Again, just counting to four and playing four even beats. It was all stuff I really needed. And she also just was very personable and dedicated to her students. So I have nothing but gratitude for that time of my life and affection for Lynn and her generosity.
Now, what were you working on? Was it really, she really got your fundamentals back on track?
Yeah, you can go through my scores from that time and you'll just see in her handwriting, count. Pay attention to the dynamics, idiot. It says forte and it says piano, you can read, so why don't you just do it? Why do you need a college professor to tell you the difference between F and P?
Right.
So this kind of butt kicking that students need.
Did you go immediately into a master's program and a doctoral program after that?
Yeah, I went straight through.
And could you describe your training in that period?
Well, again, anybody who's in the conservatory will have more or less the same thing. These schools are really all about big repertoire. And that's starting to change. They're getting a conscience about the fact that musicians need to be able to do more than play all the Beethoven sonatas or all the Chopin ballades, or, that you actually have to be able to teach, you have to be able to do collaborative stuff. But during my time, no, it was all big repertoire, which at the time is what I wanted. Give me late Beethoven sonata and, Chopin ballades and big Schumann things and Brahms. So that really is how I spent my time.
I do have a tremendous respect for concert pianists because, just playing a piece is really not what a concert pianist is all about, from my estimation. There's a ton of work that goes into it that's beyond just playing the piece, and there's massive amounts of repertoire, and it's playing it musically, and there's something there that's really admirable. It's like it's almost it's crazy, in some ways, the amount of work that a concert pianist has to do, and then the competition is so intense.
Yeah, it really is crazy. I mean, you do it because you love it. The return on investment is probably the worst of anything, But, if you can find a way to do what you love in this world, you're really one of the lucky ones. And that's the attitude of most of the pianists that I know, is that, just love this music so much and want to be in contact with it. And so they're willing to do it.
Did you have also any background in jazz at the same time?
Not formally. I grew up listening to the radio at night. There was a program on from Central Michigan University. And so that's where I got to know Keith Jarrett and was really fascinated with that. So kind of on the side, I was always goofing around with, what's a blues scale? And I had learned to play blues guitar and learned to solo over the 12-bar changes, and always had this kind of secret life in rock and roll and prog rock going on. And a lot of the understanding of harmonic function I got from that, just because you have to figure it all out for yourself. It's never written out for you. So informally, yeah, I was doing that. I did take some formal jazz lessons along the way, but it was never, I was so busy just trying to figure out the technical side of playing the big stuff that was most of my day every day.
And did your colleagues in this environment, are they all doing the same thing? Did you notice any of your colleagues also have kind of like a moonlighting jazz career or a moonlight pop career?
Yeah, sometimes it's just a church job or something that pays the bills. Sometimes it's a personal interest. Most people, if they manage to get a job, which is extremely difficult, they then sort of branch out and decide what they're interested in. I have one friend who does a lot of research into Debussy. I've got other friends who, kind of find unknown composers and record their stuff. So yeah, people tend to do something other than play Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms all the time.
Now, what happened that got you turned on to this idea of classical improvisation?
Well, I had spent a couple of years trying to get to the point where I could credibly play jazz in concert. So I spent, a few years just practicing and thinking about that, and then developing an approach to solo improvisation in jazz that I was then including on classical concerts. And the more I did it, the more I saw parallels with how classical music works. And I started thinking about, what if? What about all those stories of Bach improvising fugues? How does that work? And actually, one of the pieces that pushed me over the edge is there's a chaconne by Handel, which is G major, and it's number 435 for those who keep track of such things. And when you play these pieces, it's very obvious how each variation is constructed, and you only need a couple bits of information to do it. And I thought, why couldn't this be done in real time? It's not too much. And so I remember I started trying this in concert. I would maybe play the real piece and then interject some of my own improvised variations, and it kind of grew from there. And then I said, okay, what's the next step? The next step was I was thinking about writing a book on piano technique, because I deal with this in my teaching constantly, these kind of areas that everybody struggles with. And I had started working on it, and I found a book in our library here by a guy named Neil Stannard called Piano Technique Demystified. I have not met him, but I read this book and I said, this is more or less the book I would have written, so I need to write it, so I'm not writing this. So maybe I'll start thinking about this idea of improvisation. So it was the idea of trying to write a book that actually pushed me to look much, much deeper.
And in your research, what did you find? What were the immediate things that happened in that research that kind of changed or really got things the snowball starting to roll?
Well, for me, the goal was always to bring something to the stage. I have a lot of colleagues who are brilliant musicologists, and I email them for help all the time. And what they do is absolutely crucial. But I was not doing this kind of as a historical thing. I wanted to bring something to the stage to share with the audience as an art form. I was so interested in an art form that has that element of risk and discovery and the unknown. I mean, to me, that's the most exciting thing is, we don't quite know how this thing's going to unfold. So I was always interested in what can actually be played practically. So I started looking at those forms of improvisation and then thinking about, all right, if you want to do this, and you're a normal classical pianist, what do you have to know? What kind of mental shifts do you have to make? What kind of steps would it take to get there? So I did it all from kind of a beginner's perspective rather than a kind of historical perspective.
You mentioned in one of your videos that you said, if we take a fugue, for instance, a fugue seems terrifying just for most people because multiple lines going at the same time. People just can't wrap their head around the fact that somebody could actually make that up on the spot. But you've mentioned in a video that not only is that possible, but like even the dumbest guy could probably do it. He might do a dumb version, but he could still make a fugue. And somebody like Bach, who would be just, he would make a fugue, but he'd be really good at it because he's really good at that kind of thing. And so is that the same for classical improvisation, even at a much simpler level? Anybody could really start to pick it up.
Yes, and the reason is that improvisation was not a little extra thing they might go to a seminar on. It was absolutely at the core of their musical thinking from the beginning. So it was maybe even more, I would say it was far more natural for a keyboardist in the 18th century to improvise a piece or to complete a piece from figured bass than it would be to have what we would call a repertoire. I don't really know when the idea of, quote, having a repertoire came in. I would say certainly it would be 19th century and, into the 19th century, because they were constantly creating new music, even to accompany. You have a flute player who wants to do these flute sonatas with continuo. Well, the keyboard player has to complete the continuo reading only from the bass line. So they're always creating music.
Oh, that's interesting. You mentioned in one of the videos, in the time of Bach, no accompaniment was written out.
That's correct. Everything was done shorthand. And this is one of the connections with jazz, where no jazz player really expects to have all these notes to tell them note for note what to do. They expect to have chord symbols. And they know the parameters with which they approach these chord symbols and, the kinds of freedom they have and the kind of restrictions they have. And it's very, very natural. And in fact, it's far easier for a jazz pianist to play from a chart. If you give them this written out Mozart sonata, most of them will not really be fluent with that. And I think it's the same with this kind of improvisation. It's so core, it's so central to how they were trained, and it's so opposite the way we were trained. That's why it seems terrifying to us.
You mentioned that figured bass was something that everybody knew. It was just standard, pretty much. And could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, figured bass is, of course, a bass line with some numbers that give you anything from vague hints to very clear, unmistakable instructions about what the upper voices are. And this is the standard way for a lot of keyboard stuff to be written, especially accompaniment. So, even if it's a very large thing like Handel's Messiah, the harpsichord or organ parts and so on would be written in continuo. But also trio sonatas, flute sonatas, vocal music, all of it was done this way. And the reason it worked so well is because that not only did the figured bass give you all the information you need, but the patterns that the bass moved in were well known. So if we take, for example, a scale, an ascending scale, descending scale, major and minor, there was a system for harmonizing this that was the third thing any keyboard player would be taught. The first thing they would be taught was octaves and fifths are perfect, and thirds and sixths are imperfect, and fourths and seconds and sevenths are dissonant. The second thing they would be taught is, here's how to do a cadence, 5/1 cadence. And you need to memorize a million versions of it. And the third thing was, here's a scale in the bass. Here are the harmonies that go with that scale, ascending, descending, major, and minor. And then they would be given an assignment, a bass line, where all you need to know is cadences and this scale harmonization and a couple little modulations. And this is known as rule of the octave. And so rule of the octave was really the first thing you would learn. And once you have that, you can actually already start improvising over it. Right at the very beginning with rule of the octave. And incidentally, C.P.E. Bach, he says, if you're stuck and you're supposed to improvise and you blank, just improvise on a scale. I'm pretty sure what he means is play a scale in the bass and use your rule of the octave skills that you have. And you can quickly put together a whole piece. In fact, I can demonstrate this if you'd like. So I'm going to play the piano here. So here's a scale in G major, and here's a way, there's more than one way, but here's a way that rule of the octave could harmonize that. And you hear that this sounds very, very normal. It sounds really regular music. And that's because this system informs everything that everybody played and wrote for about 150 years.
Now, John, could you explain those harmonies there? So as you're going up the scale, that's not just necessarily 1 major, 2 minor, 3 minor, right?
No, you can't do that. The root position is going to be 1 and 5. So tonic and dominant are in root position. There's a couple different versions, but basically on the way up, every other chord is kind of like a first inversion chord, maybe with an extra note to turn it into something else. So 2 and 3 can be played as first inversion chords. 4 is a what we call a 6-5 chord. It's a first inversion 7th chord. Then you have 5. 6 is first inversion. 7, the leading tone, would be a dominant chord. On the way down, there's a chromatic note that tonicizes the dominant. And then you do a 4-2 to subvert the dominant and continue down. And then in the minor, the bass takes the melodic form of the scale, so it's different on the way up and down.
So you're saying that a student in that period, that's one of the first few things they would learn.
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at one of the great teachers, Fedele Fenaroli, it's the third thing. After intervals, cadences, then comes rule of the octave. And it's similar. It's almost always, in every treatise, if they're going to talk about the rules of music, rule of the octave is one of the early things that they get.
How does it change with the minor scales?
Well, of course, on the way up, you have to raise 6 and 7. On the way down, you lower them. So now it's going to be lowered. And now we get what we would call an augmented 6th chord. Sometimes, like earlier, maybe 17th century Germans wouldn't do this, but this is like the Italian sound to do this harmony. And then after that, it follows the other forms pretty carefully.
Did this all originate from Italy?
Yes. The most influential teaching of this comes out of the Italians. But we see Mozart teaching this. We see Mozart teaching Partimento. We see Handel teaching it. There's a very large manuscript called the Langlotz manuscript of Partimento Fugue that was around in Germany. So, it was everywhere.
There's one interesting thing that you mentioned is that musicians back then used to hold a notebook, and it was called a zibaldone. Yeah,
really, it's just an assignment book, so the master could write something in it to say, go work on this week, or the student, you could go to a concert and you hear something really great and you want to jot it down. Well, what else are you going to do? You can't buy the copy of it. You can't record it. So you've got to have some kind of system of collecting things. So the zibaldone is great for that. I use it not only to collect things, but the pedagogical value of writing by hand in ink, I think, is magnificent. And, maybe the first thing everyone would think of is, I could keep a digital zibaldone on my phone and just take pictures of things. But, you're going to click on it and then file it away and you'll never know what it was. But to sit there with paper and ink and write it out, you remember it. So I do it as a personal discipline. I keep track of, oh my goodness, bass motions and sequences and interesting passages from composers I want to understand.
Speaking of bass lines, you said that the bass is perhaps the most important line in the music. What would you do to develop your knowledge with bass?
Yeah, this idea is called bass motions or moti di basso, or Fenaroli calls it moves of the partimento, how the bass is going to move. And there are a limited number of patterns in 18th century music of what the bass can do. It can go by step, up and down. It can go chromatic. It can go up a third, down a second. It can go down a fifth, up a fourth, and so on. But there's a limited number of things it can actually do. And each of those patterns has one or more established harmonizations of the upper voices. So this rule of the octave is for stepwise, and rule of the octave is one way you can harmonize a stepwise scale. There are about 8 different ways to do it, depending on how you count. And they would deliberately study all of these. Then when they would go to their homework, to the Partimento, their job was to recognize what bass motions were in effect. So if you see a scale, you go, aha, I can do that with rule of the octave. If you see it go up a fourth, down a fifth, you go, aha, this is a circle of fifths progression. If you see it descending chromatically, you have another set of harmonies that go with it. And they are finite. You actually can know them all. It's not unlimited. You can know everything if you want to. And as they would practice these, the moves of the bass will get shorter, so they don't use an entire measure of one move. They'll use a little segment of this, and then a little segment of that. And now you have to be very quick and agile with how you harmonize it. But that's essentially how 18th century music works.
You mentioned circle of fifths. Now, a lot of people just say, learn your circle of fifths, but what does that really mean in the context of improvisation?
Well, this was taught very deliberately in the 18th century, and normally they would teach it with sevenths so that you get this lovely voice leading. So if we do this, I'm going to play on the piano here. So the bass is moving by fourths and fifths, and the upper voices have this very smooth voice leading. It's really very lovely. All you have is the thirds and sevenths of the chords moving by step. And this, again, was taught quite early in the process. I'm thinking of another teacher, Giacomo Insanguine, and as soon as he teaches the circle of fifths bass motion, he's telling them use sevenths. And so, this was absolutely universal. And then you'd have to transpose it to every key. You'd have to know how to use it. You'd have to know how to prepare the dissonance and resolve them. And then you'd be ready to play a very wide variety of music.
I read an anecdote where Liszt apparently met Beethoven and played something for Beethoven, and Beethoven asked him to transpose something on the spot, and he could do it. Now, that ability to just play, because nowadays when you learn a piece, I'm going to learn Fur-Elise, and it's going to be in this one key because the genius Beethoven wrote it in that key, and I'm not changing it. But really, it's mutable, right? You should learn to play figurations and patterns in all keys.
Yes, absolutely, because when you transpose, you get away from thinking of music as this white button and that black button and this white key and that black key. Now you're not stuck to the individual keys. You understand the principles that are at work. It's really the same as learning to say something in a couple of different languages. You get at the real idea you're trying to communicate, and you get away from the idiosyncrasies of English or Spanish or Latvian or whatever, and real idea. And so in my book, every single exercise, I'm just constantly saying transpose, transpose, transpose.
There's a great video that you have talking about how classical improvisation sort of faded away, and one of the reasonings is the genius culture, where we started to elevate our composers in the 19th century to almost godlike proportions. And it really is the case, I think, nowadays. We almost speak of these people as hallowed people, hallowed beings. Their notes can't be changed. But it's kind of absurd, right?
Well, on the one hand, it is good and right to respect these artists because history has been correct to pick out Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, and some others. I think there are many other good composers who could be recognized, but I don't know that there's another Bach that we missed. So from that point of view, yeah, it's true. Bach is the best. On the other hand, the idea that his music is immutable, that really wasn't how he worked. And that's not really, the idea of the time. There was a book that came out in the 90s called Musicking by a British musicologist. I think his name's Christopher Small. I'll have to check on that. And the idea was that music is not just this masterpiece. It's this human activity where we get together and some of us play and some of us listen and maybe some dance and some move chairs and music stands around, and we're all, kind of participating. And the important thing is this holistic activity of which the piece of music is one part. So he calls this musicking, and it's like this cool idea of this human activity. So I made up the word masterpiecing, which is the opposite. That's, this great work. And so everybody shut up and don't sneeze or cough or clap between movements and be absolutely quiet, and everything has to be perfect. And so now the role of the performer is important but secondary. The role of the audience is nothing.
It's almost like the performer is changed to priest, almost, in a way. It's just reading the hallowed scripture.
So I like this idea that musicking is this activity we're doing together, and that's kind of the direction I've gone when I perform. For example, I'll ask the audience to choose a key. And, often what will happen, I was just playing in Latvia, and the first thing that happened is a bunch of piano teachers from Riga, Latvia. I said, would someone choose a key? And some guy yells out G sharp minor, and everybody laughs. Well, see, now we have a game. Now we've got a game going on. The game is I told them, I stuck myself out there, and I kind of bragged that I could do this. And they're going, okay, we're going to call your bluff, smarty pants. So, what can you do in G sharp minor? So now they're very, very interested in what's about to happen when I improvise, because they've invested in this game. So now we're going to really have some fun. And it just creates a different dynamic in the performance from y'all sit there and, be quiet. I will deliver to you this work of genius, and you will quietly appreciate it. So I love this sense of play, of having a game that we're doing together. And so improvisation has kind of fit together with this idea of musicking. So I kind of try to work with those two ideas in tandem.
I love that. It's really, in a sense, one thing that really excites me is that it definitely shows that you have a fluency of the language of music. And one thing that I really look for is when music is being created, are we looking at an artist creating something, creating music, his or her brain and skill and as taste in the moment, or are we just getting a conduit who is just producing somebody else's music, in a fashion? And I like that idea of music as a language, and all these things that you're teaching, they're really elements of vocabulary building and grammatical, musical functioning, which is very interesting, and I think that's the way really we should look at music.
Well, I think there's room for a variety of approaches. I mean, I'm going to keep on going to concerts of composed, written, memorized music. I'm from that world, and that world will always be a part of me. But on the other hand, when I was teaching at the National Academy in Latvia, and we were having a class meeting, and there was a professor in there, and he said, well, do you ever want to write down one of these improvisations, because he thought it was a, maybe not too bad of a piece that could be kept. So he said, do you maybe write it down and play it again? And I said, no, I would never do that, because I asked the people there, would you rather hear me play something for you that I improvised a year ago and then I wrote it down? Or would you like to hear me create something absolutely new for you that's just ours? It belongs to us just here in this room. And it's completely new, and it's only going to happen one time. And they all said, oh, of course, we want to hear something new. So to me, this is actually part of the art form, is the newness and the uniqueness, and that it's only for them, only this one time, and it will never come back quite the same way. to me, I actually value that very highly.
Yeah, I like that balance because you do have to memorize in music. You have to learn forms, as we're going to get into with your book. There are rules. I mean, you have to learn certain things.
Yes.
But within, like for instance, one thing I've really liked is that people used to improvise cadenzas, and now people don't really do that anymore. But a cadenza was a pretty exciting part. You get to see somebody show off in a concert, and that was all that person, which I think is a cool thing where it kind of balances memorizing the beautiful composed melodies and themes, and then being able to add your own insight into the piece.
Yes. I always thought it was interesting when Mozart's students were going to play his music and they were not quite comfortable improvising a cadenza, he would provide one for them, and the word he used to describe it, he called it a pony.
Oh.
And I think the idea there is that you're not ready to carry yourself through, you need a ride.
Right.
And he would kind of tease them a little bit and say, oh, okay, I'll get you a pony to help you out.
Let's talk a little bit about the book now, The Pianist's Guide to Classical Improvisation. Now, this is volume 1, right?
Well, we'll see if there's going to be a volume 2 if I survive.
Okay. And very prestigious publisher, Oxford University Press. I'd like to talk a little bit about the different sections of the book. Now, let's go through it a little bit, give the audience a taste. Now, you mentioned if somebody buys the book, right, what's the first thing that you're going to make them do on page 1 or page 2?
I'm going to give a long speech about how you have to go to the piano and do everything, and you can't just sit in your armchair, blah, 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 do all the exercises, trust me, believe everything I say. With that, the first thing I do, I actually don't proceed in historical order, and I have a reason for that. My reason is a thing that I call the linear rhizomic struggle, and I should explain that. Those like me who've been to conservatory and learned all this repertoire, we have trained ourselves to do music in a linear manner. So if I play, for example, I'll play the piano here. If I do this Bach prelude or whatever it may be, for however long I'm working on that, let's say for a semester, half a semester, every time I sit down to play this piece, I'm going to play it exactly the same way. Day 1, day 2, day 3, and to the lesson and to the concert and to the jury and everything else. And this creates in me the idea that music is done by a script that moves in linear fashion. There's only one correct way through this, and if I miss something, I am off track and the piece is broken. And we get very, very, very good at this to the point that, of course, undergrad students are playing long memorized recitals of difficult music. Well, you take that same kid and you say, all right, sit down and improvise, and now you have to make these choices like the branching of roots underground. At this point there's a decision, and at this point there's a decision. That's what rhizomic means. It's like the branching of roots. And there's almost no mental capacity to do that. You can watch these very, very capable musicians get absolutely paralyzed simply because they haven't trained to do rhizomic stuff. So I call this the linear to rhizomic struggle, where it just takes time to learn to be okay with uncertainty and choice in music making. So I start with figuration prelude where we have very few choices to make. So we use a basic harmonic progression, and they might do one thing to it. They might choose A or B, black or white, left or right. Then we add another thing, and they can choose a couple things. So it's a very easy on-ramp because of this linear way of thinking that is so powerfully built into classical pianists. I don't think a jazz player really can even understand how linear we have become because of the way we're taught. So the book is built around the learner's progress less than around 18th century procedures. Classical musicians have some astonishing skills, and they are astonishing because they're repeated and rehearsed so much. But if you don't practice making choices and decisions and living with uncertainty, of course you're not going to be comfortable with it. So that's really where I come from in the book. It's this gradual increase in what is given or established and what you can choose. and we gradually open up the parameters of that. And I do that just because this is my own experience learning the stuff. I'm trying to teach it the way I learned it, where at every stage, if you're going to make music and you're going to learn, you have to be reasonably happy and comfortable. I don't think we'll learn well if we're miserable and falling apart and shaking and all of that. And so it has to be easy enough at every stage for you to have this sense of wellness and joy. And when you can have that at one stage, now you're ready to move up a little bit more and take on greater challenges.
So I see the figuration prelude is you've outlined a simple harmony and you can dress it in whatever pattern you'd like, so to speak. Now move on to toccata. Explain that form.
I use that word to refer to this kind of very free style.
Like a fantasia in a way? A fantasy?
Exactly. There's not that much difference historically between toccata and fantasia and even prelude, can be the same thing. It's where you can kind of rhetorically start and stop. You can have a big flourish and then pause for effect. And so each flourish or gesture can be a specific technique, and then you can catch your breath and think about what you're going to do next. So it's a great way to kind of use new techniques, but not feel like you're mentally unable to weave them together because you can present them one thing at a time.
Does the toccata have a freer rhythmic sense compared to like the figuration prelude?
Toccata normally will sort of move between various textures. Although, the 18th century composers were not systematic about what they called things. Anytime you try to categorize these words, toccata, fantasia, prelude, whatever, you will find some piece that doesn't fit your definition. But very, very generally speaking, the toccata is really free, kind of off the cuff. Check this out. Hey, have you ever seen a move like this? Now how about this? Here's a cool idea. It has that kind of quality.
Now, what about variations? I love Mozart's variations, and Beethoven's done a ton of them. So do you start with a theme and then do you show ideas on how to do variations? And is that more a melodic thing, or do you still go with that the bass line?
No, we're doing it harmonically.
Okay.
The melodic thing is a little bit more galant, classical, where they were really making the variations on the tune. In the 18th century, variation or chaconne or passacaglia, which are all the same thing, is on the harmonic progression.
Oh, they're all the same thing. Okay, that's very good information for me.
Again, you can try to have a nice musicological difference between them, but someone is always going to pull the rug out from under you and
name it the wrong thing, so to speak.
Yeah, or they're going to have a chaconne in a major key in 4/4, or something will be off about it.
What is an imitation?
Imitation is where you have some idea in one voice, for example, here on the piano. So you hear this little idea in the soprano, and then it's followed later by the same idea in another voice. And this chapter is just on two-part short points of imitation, which are often used to kind of launch music in the 18th century. Even music that's not going to stay imitative, it will often use that like charcoal fuel starter, just to get it going, to get a barbecue going. So it's a chapter on how to construct those and what, the harmonic implications of those.
How is that like, it sounds like almost like a round, how does it harmonically work?
It's very conservative generally, harmonically, especially if you're improvising and you don't have time to sort of make this elaborate wiring diagram of how it all fits together. So you can have only a harmony of tonic, or you can have, what's very frequent is a kind of tonic dominant alteration. Tonic subdominant will work as well. But generally the harmony is very, very simple with these little imitation points, simply because once you do something in one time continuum and then the other time continuum has to match, you can't afford all these crazy harmonic wanderings.
Now let's move on to the dance suites. And Bach had some suites, right? The English suite, the French suite. Could you describe the different dance forms? Now, would it be fair to say that a musician from that period would be pretty intimately aware of all these different dance forms?
Oh, yeah. The suite is really just a playlist. The way I would describe it is, in contemporary terms, it's like a dance band that scribbles out a playlist on the back of a napkin right before the reception starts. So, let's make them do the twist, and then some kind of big dubstep would be cool. Slow dance, and then we need something for the old people, like the Charleston. So it's this assortment of dances that really can be anything. There's kind of a standard set of expected pieces that might be in there, but again, anytime you try to categorize, somebody won't follow the category.
Now, you mentioned there'd be an introduction to a partimento and schemata. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, there's been great work on partimento and schemata. In fact, the two big books on this are with my same publisher and my same editor. The book on schemata is by Robert Yerdigan, Music in the Galant Style. And Partimento, The Art of Partimento by Giorgio Sanguinetti. They're both musicologists, and they've done these kind of exhaustive, wonderful, interesting studies of these phenomena. So didn't feel like I needed to repeat any of that, and I'm not of their caliber as a historian to do so. What I understand is sitting at the piano and not getting it and wishing I could get it, and just kind of banging my head against the piano until I get it. Like, that's what I understand, because that's my life. Those chapters are me going, okay, schemata and partimento sound cool. What can I actually do with this? And what can a beginning improviser actually do with this? So that's what those chapters are.
What is a schemata?
Schemata is a short pattern of two voices, typically bass and soprano. And these are, they have a specific function, like it's a good morning, how are you? So interesting weather today. So anyway, the reason I called you here today was I wanted to talk about, all right, well, it looks like we've covered everything. I just want to thank you and goodbye. They have these kind of places in the conversation. They function. They introduce, or they open up a possibility, or they close things down, or they delay, or they play a trick on you, like you think it's going to end, but then it's not. And they recur over and over and over again in the galant, Mozart and Haydn and Durante and etc., Dittersdorf. And if you kind of identify them and practice them, you can assemble them into pieces. So, for example, one of the schemata is that Yerdigan loves to talk about is the Romanesca. So maybe this would be a good Romanesca. So the bass went 1, 7, 6, 3, and the melody line was focused around 1 and 5. Okay, so that just has a kind of classical sound to it, and that's an opener. That's like, good morning, everybody. Well, then there are these other schemata. There's one called a printer. And the printer is often used to answer the Romanesca. So let me put them together. So that's a Romanesca and a printer and a half cadence. And you hear it just, man, that sounds like real music. So the idea is that if you can identify and master some schemata, you can have little plans, little templates where you can fill in and make up your own that fit the pattern, but generate pieces.
I was kind of struck by when I was reading up on perhaps Chopin preparing for his preludes. Chopin was a huge fan of Bach. And in fact, many of the Romantic composers, Schumann, Mendelssohn, they all loved Bach. And can I ask you this question? Is figured bass and all this knowledge, is it resilient enough to handle all the harmonic adventurism of the 19th and the 20th century? Now, perhaps not atonal music, but, like the late Romantic kind of music. Is that like operating system of the figured bass, can it handle pretty adventurous stuff?
That is a very interesting question. whenever you're working on these old systems, you have to look at whether this was what they actually used or whether you're superimposing something. Partimento was something they actually used. Schemata is a modern analytical system we're superimposing on what they did. So they work a little differently. Can we then superimpose figured bass on the sound of Brahms? I don't know. I can foresee a lot of complexities with that. I think each age kind of develops its own tools and is pretty good at it. So jazz invented the chord chart, and it works brilliantly. I don't know what you would gain by superimposing it. I think the amount of work would maybe be so much that nobody would pay attention.
Do you see parallels, at least, between the different ages?
Yes. And the thing I would say about figured bass is that it gives you a kind of comprehensive understanding of what is happening on every musical level. It changes the way you hear music. It improves your hearing. So I think it's useful for anybody at in any historical style. Interestingly, you mentioned this idea of cadenza and adding an improvised section to an existing piece. There's a composer named Patrick Zimmerli who wrote some music for Brad Meldau and Kevin Hayes, and two piano stuff. And he had exactly this. It was these improvisatory sections written into composed music. And the album is called Modern Music. I recommend it highly. I contacted Patrick and got his permission to make a solo version of one of these pieces. And essentially, it's a sonata with an improvised development section with prescribed chords for each measure of the development. I think this has a lot of possibility for the coming years, contemporary styles, kind of jazz classical crossover, this kind of approach. So I would recommend the Modern Music album. Of course, it's played beautifully by Meldau and Hayes, and the whole album's super interesting.
I want to ask you two things before we end off. The first one is, who are some players in the classical improvisation field that you admire and you think you can recommend the audience to check out?
Well, I love anybody that kind of knows what they're doing and has some ability, even if their approach is opposite mine. My favorite pianist in the classical style actually is Grigory Sokolov, even though he does the opposite of what I do. He plays one recital program per year and he practices the socks off of it. And he plays it exactly the same every night, but it is so good. If you want someone to make a strong case for memorizing and playing the same repertoire over and over again, he makes a great case for it because it's like a force of nature. But I'm very open. I love Meldau and Jarrett and Keith Jarrett and all these contemporary improvisers. I listened to your podcast with John Andrew and Dr. Reuter Feenstra. They mentioned a bunch of names, which I think are great. Let me point you in a different direction. If you want to hear some students who had 2 months of training in improvisation, doing their first public improvisations, search YouTube for JVLMA video. This is Jozef Vitol's Latvian Music Academy in Riga, Latvia. These are my students. And they have some video up. They're doing unmeasured prelude, chaconne. There's one guy doing a prelude and fugue. And this might be interesting to people who want to see what's possible after a short period of intense study.
That leads me to my second question. I wanted to ask about your European tour and the reactions that you got from basically faculty and students as you introduced these ideas.
Right. I was in Malta just to judge a piano competition, but then the kind of improvisation teaching part of the tour started in Ireland at the wonderful Cork School of Music. And then I went to the Latvian Academy, and from there did visits to the Tallinn Estonian Academy and to Vilnius, to the Lithuanian National Academy. The response was they're very, very interested because it's difficult to get any training in this area. Usually they were a little bit wide-eyed about, transpose everything to every key, the kind of sweeping sort of practicing that we do. But then they always wanted to know what's next. How can I get more? How can we build this into our standard curriculum? At both Ireland and Latvia, they're interested in that. Everybody said, is there some school or festival or something I can go to learn? So I'm hoping I can actually organize a European summer festival where they can all come, maybe a couple weeks in the summer, an intensive thing.
Can you mention any particular students that really, really impressed you just from a short period of time working with you?
Well, I don't know that I would mention specific names, but really it was so delightful in every country. One, how interested they were and how ready they were to do this. In one country in particular where they tend to promote a kind of atonal free improvisation where you don't really have to have any tonal system, you can kind of, just bang on the piano. And they have a professor there who's really into this. I asked the students privately, is this, this crazy modern stuff? And they were, no, not really. I want to play tonal music. That's the music of my heart. And so they want to play beautiful music that people want to listen to. They don't want to throw bicycle chains onto the strings of the piano and shout and do whatever.
Dr. Mortensen, do you like some atonal music though?
Of course. It's very hard to judge music because it all comes from a cultural context you have to understand. But anything where there's a kind of real cultural weight behind it and it has something to say, even if it's not my thing and it's weird, I want to hear it. I want to give it a chance. I'm less interested in types of music where you can know almost nothing but still do a pretty credible job of this kind of music. Like, you don't have to work that hard. You don't have to know anything. You don't have to prepare that much. You can just kind of do. I tend to say, well, there's probably not that much going on.
I kind of like all kinds of music, but I am really fascinated by this period of, I guess, the 18th, the Galant, and the Baroque period, because it just seems like a tradition that's been completely lost. And it's such a shame because we're playing this music over and over, probably thousands of recitals all over the world, but very few can actually speak in the language of these particular periods. And I think what you're doing is just remarkable and very, very exciting, because I think a lot of people are wondering, they're putting two and two together. These guys used to improvise. We don't. Nowadays, we're getting to see a more nuanced appreciation of these composers. We're seeing them more as humans, perhaps, and we're starting to have this urge to see how they thought. And I think that's a wonderful thing that we're starting to really try to piece together what they're thinking. What are you yourself trying to teach yourself and learn in this period when it comes to improvisation in these styles?
Well, as I said earlier, for me, the whole thing was built around the idea of what can I bring to the stage and what can I help my students bring to the stage. So what I'm interested in is, how can we learn to prepare to go out there and actually improvise for people? My kind of musical motto or mission statement is music is for people. And this ties in with the idea of musicking rather than masterpiecing. So what I'm doing for myself is I'm sort of gradually expanding the types of pieces I know how to invent in front of people. So I started with, variations, and then I started to do more toccata, and then what did I do? Oh, suite. I started doing suites after that. Fugues, preludes and fugues, French overture, and then I started doing sonatas on themes suggested by the audience, which is another kind of different area. And so I'm gradually trying to build the variety of what I can do and therefore what I can teach and share with students.
The Pianist's Guide to Classical Improvisation with Oxford University Press, 2019. Is it coming out that late?
Well, they have a long process where they get it ready. Oxford, as you know, is a pretty prestigious publisher, and they're extremely particular about how a book is prepared. So the manuscript is actually done. I'm finishing up the last few musical examples in finale, and then we go into the production phase. So yeah, it's slated for release in 2019.
I can't wait to buy that book. Absolutely exciting, and I think a lot of people feel the same way. Dr. John Mortensen, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your expertise. Hope you'll come back again. Thank you so much.
Good to talk to you, Nicole. Take care.